So today we get to start on a new chapter, and this is, funnily enough, a chapter that I always forget exists. And in fact, there's a subsection of this chapter that I always forget to teach on attention and awareness. And it always makes me laugh when I realize that year after year, I have continuously had to teach that part separately, possibly after the fact, when I figure out that I've missed it yet again. But this time, for the first time in 3 years, I've remembered to include it, and I like my section on attention enough that we're going to do it early on. So this is going to be another one of those chapters where we do things a little bit out of order, but it's a chapter where it kind of makes sense to do stuff out of order because consciousness is such a weird combination of sort of related concepts. So they're all vaguely connected by the idea of involving our mind and our awareness, but they aren't necessarily direct lines in between them. It's not as unified as something like sensation and perception. So you're going to find in this chapter we can talk about awareness and attention, but also things like sleep and different patterns of sleep, as well as hypnosis and altering our consciousness. So this kind of covers a little bit of everything. So we're going to start off with a general statement of what is consciousness, and then we're also going to get into sort of how we might study it and different perspectives on it. And you're going to find right off the bat that with such a vague concept, we end up with fairly vague definitions as well. And so you're going to find some fairly circular definitions here. And that is based on the idea that consciousness is a weird concept anyways, so don't be too put off by it. But our definition of consciousness is the awareness of both internal and external stimuli. So our subjective awareness, or being conscious of ourselves and our environment. So you might be aware that you are maybe a little bit hungry or a little bit cold, or maybe you notice externally that the room is very bright. Those would be things that you are now conscious or aware of. And you're going to find that awareness is used in the definition of consciousness, and consciousness is used in the definition of awareness. And we never quite get at the root of what exactly it is. So if we're going to be a little bit vague about it, let's talk about some properties of consciousness, some aspects that might help us get a little bit of understanding here. So the first thing about consciousness is that it is both subjective and private. So it's something internal, it's something that you interpret about your own consciousness, but no one else really knows what's going on in your head, nor can you know really what's going on in someone else's. So you can't know others' reality, and others cannot know yours. Consciousness is also dynamic. We are constantly changing based on what we are currently thinking of, other factors that are influencing our consciousness at the time. We go through cycles, even predicted cycles. So daily we have cycles of sleep and awakeness. We have cycles of being very alert and maybe less alert. We have ways of influencing that. So it's always changing, always moving, and it's something internal, which is sort of problematic. We also have this idea of being self-reflective. So our mind is aware of its own consciousness. So we can have these very meta discussions about being conscious of our own consciousness. And so being aware of what we're thinking about can actually then in turn change how we think. So all of these things kind of come together and explain that consciousness is this moving thing that is very, very difficult to quantify, difficult to measure, and as psychologists, we can start thinking about how difficult it must be to try and study this concept. And so that's how we're going to move into our broad types of testing for consciousness. So we're going to find that each of these is sort of good at one thing and not so great at others. Sometimes you're going to combine different methods. Sometimes you only need one based on the question that you're asking, but this just gives you a broad overview of some of the stuff that's pretty common. So the first of these is self-reports, where you ask someone to describe their own inner experiences. What are they thinking, or how are they thinking? And this could be in the form of interviews or surveys or even questionnaires. So in the image there, we have a Likert scale where it's asking sort of a statement and how strongly do you agree or disagree with this statement. Could ask how strongly does this particular statement describe your mental process or how you approach a particular situation. So it gives us this direct insight into that subjective experience of someone else. But you can probably see the potential for issues here in that we can't verify that they're telling the truth. So they might be giving us useful information about how they're thinking, but they might also be leaving out important information. Or maybe they're not explaining it well. Or maybe we're interpreting their explanation wrong. So there's that little bit of uncertainty introduced here where it's really hard to quantify something that we're hearing about secondhand. And so if we have issues with that, maybe we want to use a physiological study, which we've kind of talked about before in our second chapter. But we might connect some of our biological processes to our mental ones. So maybe you have someone in an fMRI scanner and you're going to play different sounds for them and see which areas of the brain are active. Or maybe you're going to have an EEG cap on them and measure what their brain is doing at different stages of sleep. So this gives us a nice objective measure of our physiological responses. So the participant can't lie or falsify information because you're just measuring what their body is doing naturally. But now we're even more removed from those subjective experiences. So we don't know exactly what's running through their mind when a particular part of their brain lights up. We can assume it has something to do with the sound that we just played, but we don't know exactly how they're framing it or what they're thinking about because that's not part of this study. This is why sometimes you'll combine things, so you'll see what part of their brain lights up, and then maybe ask them about their thought process. So some pros and cons for each of those. You might also rely on a behavioral study. So this is when you look at behavioral responses to particular situations. This is a way to have sort of an objective measure, especially if you set things up or frame things in the correct way. With a lot of these things, we kind of make assumptions about what information an individual might have and what information they need to use in what particular way in order to solve a problem. So this is really good even for non-human animals. So you don't have to explain things in a particular way. You don't have to rely on them to tell you how they're thinking. We might have a problem that they can only solve if they can frame it in a way that involves a certain type of thinking. So that's, again, vague. So let's look at an example of this, one of our most famous behavioral study types. And this is the Rouge test. So this is designed to help us evaluate the presence of a theory of mind, which is one of those controversial psychological topics that deals with whether you have an understanding of your own sense of self and how your sense of self is different from other people's sense of self. With humans, we go through this when we're fairly young. If you ever take sort of the 105 part of this course, you'll talk about development and how children sort of reach a stage where they assume that the information that they have, absolutely everyone else knows the same information. But when they hit about 3 years old, they switch and can suddenly grasp the idea that I know that this is what's happening, but somebody else who doesn't have the same knowledge won't think the same thing. And for the longest time, this theory of mind was thought to be exclusive to humans. But a lot of these behavioral studies have started to frame things in such a way that we can ask this question of non-human animals. So our image at the bottom here is a chimpanzee who's undergoing a Rouge test. And this test is fairly simple. It involves a mirror, and previously it involved the use of rouge or blush. Nowadays you can use paint or pigment of some kind. It doesn't have to be rouge. But if you can see it in the image, the chimpanzee has a spot of red paint on his forehead. And so he's sitting in front of a mirror, and the question is, does he recognize that reflection as himself? So if he does, if he has a concept of that chimp that I'm seeing isn't someone else, it's me, then he would notice that there's something on the reflection's face and reach up and brush his own face. So that kind of behavior would only happen if he could make the connection that that reflection is me, so what I'm seeing there is here. And this is a really interesting test. So this mirror recognition task is another way of talking about it. But they've had this go successfully with elephants. I believe dolphins have been able to do this. Some corvids, the jury's out on parrots. Some of them seem to. If mine are anything to judge by, they do not. So there's a couple of new species where we're saying, yeah, they do have this concept of self, at least as established by this specific test. And that's why it's one of those controversial topics where people don't necessarily agree if recognition is sufficient to deem self-awareness, but it's a step in that right direction. So these behavioral studies are all about framing information, framing a situation in a particular way that an animal's behavioral response will tell them what information they have and how they can use it. So we can make some assumptions about the processes going on based on how they choose to use the information that they have. We do something fairly similar with our chickadees, and we'll talk about this in the learning chapter, where I do sort of a mini lesson on operant conditioning, specifically with sounds in chickadees. But we expose chickadees to different kinds of sounds, and we teach them that one kind of sound is good and one kind of sound is bad, and then we introduce them to new sounds and see if they sort them such that they are good or bad. And so the good sounds, they would go to the feeder to get food, and the bad sounds, they would stay out of the feeder because they don't want the lights to turn out. And we can tell then which sounds do they perceive as similar and which ones do they perceive as dissimilar. So we've set up a behavioral test that tells us how they treat information. So there are tons and tons of ways that we can use these kinds of studies, and these would be some of the only ways that we can test for consciousness and things like that in non-human animals. So I suppose we could, if you were creative, you could work something like brain imaging in other species too. It's just a lot less common. So the next couple of topics are going to be a little bit of a refresher from our start off in the course. So when we began, we were talking about different perspectives, different views on how we framed human behavior. And because we're looking at consciousness, we're going to focus back on the two major views that were focused in on the presence of the mind, or the involvement of our mind in our behavior. So the two big ones are the psychodynamic perspective and the cognitive perspective. So these are the ones that really cared or really leaned into the necessity of our mind and the things that we're conscious of in determining our behavior. We're also going to mention things like our behaviorists, because they would really hate this idea of consciousness influencing our behavior. So this is sort of a little bit of a refresher of some of those topics we've mentioned previously. And so with the psychodynamic view, the first we're going to talk about, you should always, when you hear psychodynamic, start thinking Freud, and that's because he was the one who established this field. We are going to talk about how this field has changed since Freud's initial inception of it, but we're going to start with the basic process, and of course we could spend an entire course on the psychodynamic view, but we're just going to focus in on the three main points, and that is our conscious, preconscious, and unconscious minds. So our conscious mind would include the mental events that we are currently aware of, the stuff that we're actively thinking about. So sitting here in lecture, you are probably listening to what I'm saying and making some connections with information that you already have in your brain. maybe deciding what words are important to write down, maybe deciding what other stuff you want to connect with to help remember, that sort of thing. Our preconscious includes events that are outside of our current awareness, but that we could easily recall. So when I mentioned our behaviorists and the fact that they really dislike the idea of the conscious mind influencing our behavior, maybe you remembered that they were big proponents of environmental influences, of our behavior being a direct connection from things going on in our environment. So that might be a fact that was in your preconscious and you should have been easily able to remember it. And then the last thing is our unconscious. And this is all the stuff that is not brought into our conscious awareness. This is stuff that's usually ignored, never thought of, and pushed to the background. And in typical Freud fashion, he framed this as a lot of things that were actively repressed, things that were related to aggression and arousal, and a lot of things that couldn't be expressed in society. And it's a very interesting perspective for that reason. But this unconscious and this focus on our sort of repressed childhood and memories that we don't recall and bad events that have happened, that's one of the things that most people disliked about this perspective. And that's why the modern psychodynamic perspective doesn't focus or doesn't lean into that aspect as much anymore. And so when most textbooks frame this concept, this conscious versus preconscious versus unconscious, they tend to visualize it as an iceberg, where our conscious would be that part of the iceberg that sticks up above the water. So it's the stuff that's exposed to the air. Our preconscious is the stuff that's just at the surface, just below the surface, where if the iceberg shifted just a little bit, it could easily be exposed. And then the unconscious is all of this stuff that's deep and dark in the depths that should never see the light of day. That's typically how they frame it. So that might help you with these three concepts. And of course, we can have some criticisms of this perspective. We've already hinted very heavily about some of them. We might have made that connection that our behaviorists really dislike this reliance on conscious mental processes that might explain our behavior. And when they heard about the unconscious processes that Freud was really leaning into, where he was convinced that a lot of our desires and a lot of our drives came from things that we weren't aware of, the behaviorists really disliked that. So they absolutely disagreed with pretty much every aspect of this psychodynamic view. And even if we look at our cognitive and more modern psychodynamic psychologists, they had quite a few issues with some of the aspects of the original theory. Specifically, they disagreed with that focus on unconscious sexual and aggressive urges. So even with modern psychodynamic perspectives, a psychologist might ask you about your childhood. They might ask you about things that you aren't actively thinking about, but they're a lot less likely to go on that hunt for deep, dark, hidden secrets and desires like Freud would have. So we've kind of moved away from that aspect and sort of reframed it with more focus on the other parts. All right, so if these cognitive theorists really disliked that psychodynamic view, what was their take on it? So in contrast to our psychodynamic view, they focused on the conscious and unconscious not as sort of competing, completely separate ideas, but as complementary forms of processing. So instead of having our conscious and our unconscious being distinct and never mixing, our cognitive psychologists said that we use both conscious and unconscious in order to process and interact with information. So specifically, we would look at controlled processing and automatic processing. So our controlled processing, which is sometimes called effortful processing, this is something that you are actively in control of. You are putting effort, putting energy into this process. You're voluntarily using your attention. You are focusing on something in order to carry it out. So maybe you're listening to the lecture and you're choosing which words are important to write down. So you're going to find the ones that make the most sense, maybe bring in extra information from other things that you know. You're going to draw some connections and make notes that are kind of an abridged version that makes sense to you. So it's a slow process, but it's very flexible. You can bring in extra information, you can adapt and change as you go, or maybe you're more of an automatic processor. And this is when it is involving minimal conscious processing. So things are happening without a whole bunch of awareness. So maybe instead of picking and choosing which words are important, maybe you're going to write down word for word exactly what you hear. So you're having less involvement in it, but you're putting down every single word, you're getting every piece of information that you needed. So it's really fast, but it's very static. So even when I go off on a tangent, you might still be writing about those tangents, whether they're relevant or not. Another way to think of this is if you drive either a car or a bike, maybe you commute on the same path every day on your way to school. So you get in the car, you drive from home to school, you don't have to think too much about it. Maybe you even get to campus and go, whoa, wait a second, when did I get here? I don't even remember the drive. That would be relying heavily on your automatic processing. You've done the drive so many times that you know where you need to turn, you know what the speed limits are, you know to watch for traffic and stuff like that. No big deal. But the next day, maybe there's construction along the route and they have a detour set up. So they make you turn somewhere that you're not used to turning. Your automatic processing is absolutely useless in that situation because now you're doing something new and you have no idea where to go from there. So you'd have to switch over to that controlled or effortful processing in order to determine A, where are you? B, where do you want to go? And C, how do we get from where I am to where I need to be? So with that controlled processing, it's using up a lot more information, or it's using up a lot more resources and energy. It's a lot slower because we have to think about every stage in the process, but it gives us that flexibility. It lets us find creative solutions to problems. Our automatic processing can be beneficial because it's really fast. It's very low intensity for resources, so you can do stuff in the background. Maybe while you're walking, you can also carry out a conversation because you don't have to pay attention to walking. But we're stuck with that static process where you can only do exactly what you know to already do. So if you're encountering a new situation, a new problem, it can cause issues if you don't know how to sort of encounter them or change around them. And so that's a great way to sort of switch over and start talking about awareness and attention, because we were just looking at stuff that we are paying attention to and things that we are not actively paying attention to. And so more of our fairly circular definitions, we can talk about awareness as our ability to directly know and perceive, to feel, or to be cognizant of events. Basically, it's stuff that we can be conscious of, which is the definition that I got when I looked it up on Wikipedia. I think the Encyclopedia Britannica had the same basic thing. So we use consciousness in our definition of awareness and awareness in our definition of consciousness. So that's fun. But we do get to introduce a little bit more clarity when we talk about attention. And we talk about attention as almost like focused awareness or concentrated awareness. So you are paying attention to a particular stimulus or a particular situation, and usually you're focusing on one thing at the expense or the exclusion of everything else in that environment. So if you are listening to the lecture, then maybe you're not listening to the sounds that the fans are making, or maybe you're explicitly ignoring the fact that you have a waiting text message. So you're focusing your attention on one thing and excluding other things. So we can have directed attention, where we sort of point our attention at something. It can also end up being we're sort of drawn to something, whether we mean to or not. But this idea of attention can also be tied in with the idea of having limited mental resources. So you're focusing on the lecture, one would hope, and ignoring everything else because you can't pay attention to everything. Our brain can only process so much information, so you have to pick and choose what is most important. So you're going to block out the irrelevant stimuli and you're going to focus on what you have deemed important. And so you're prioritizing your resources in order to make best use of them. We are capable of dividing our attention, and it can actually be adaptive to divide our attention. So it could be beneficial to be able to walk and carry on a conversation, or to drive and be able to change the radio station. But there are limits. If we have limited mental resources, we need to be careful of how much and which kinds of resources we're using up. So we have a lot of difficulty if tasks end up requiring similar resources. So listening to a lecture and responding to a text are both going to involve those language centers of your brain. So you can't really give both your full attention. You'd kind of have to pick one or the other. We also have to keep in mind that there are other aspects that can go on. So something like driving. Driving is very mentally taxing, especially if you're paying attention to things like pedestrians. Maybe the weather conditions aren't great and things like that. You might even find that if you're driving in bad weather, you might turn the radio down to give you just a little bit more mental resources. And that's not to say that your ears and listening to music is actively competing with the same resources that you're using to drive, but if you only have so much energy to burn, maybe you don't want to have other things that might distract you. And so one of the biggest things of divided attention that you'll see is the conversation of distracted driving. And I find this one really interesting because I've kind of realized that I had a different experience to this than you guys who are a little bit younger. So when I was growing up, cell phones were just becoming a thing, and I was around when they put laws into place saying that you couldn't drive with a cell phone, when they first switched over to hands-free. And they were saying, okay, well, if it's distracting and people are getting in more accidents because they're on their phones, we're going to make them put down their phones. They can still have their conversations, but it has to be without their hands being occupied. The assumption there being that the issue was because they were only driving with one hand, the other hand was holding onto the phone. But in fact, even just being on the phone with someone, even if it's hands-free, if you have access to both hands on the wheel, you still have reduced capacity because you're focused on a conversation with someone else. And there's some really cool research that's been talked about out of the U of A. Dr. Singhal, he did some fairly recently, but it was looking at the fact that having a conversation with someone who's not in the car with you is just as distracting as holding the phone and having that same conversation. And the idea there is if you're driving and you have a passenger who's sitting next to you, if, say, a deer jumps out on the road, your passenger will see that and react to it. So it's extra information that sort of fits in the current situation. But if you're on the phone with someone, they have no idea what's going on around you. So something might be happening, but they're still talking. They're not adjusting their behavior to allow you to focus, and so it can be even more distracting. So all of this is just another way to say that it's a lot more complicated than what they originally thought. And there's a lot more research showing that you're probably a lot better off just not bothering with a phone call until you're stationary. Because our reaction times to things like pedestrians hopping out or animals on the road or even bad weather conditions, our reaction time gets a lot worse if we are distracted. All right. So next we can talk about directing our attention. And we've kind of already hinted that this can be something intentional or it can be something unintentional. So a conscious process, you choose to shift your attention to one particular item, to ignore something else, but it can also happen without your intent. So there are certain stimuli that are just so attention grabbing that we can't help but look at them. So if somebody ran by and they had a really loud backpack and they were making lots of noise, you might glance over. You're very aware of their presence. We also have things like emergency vehicles. Between the fact that they're moving, they're very loud, they have flashing lights. All of these things are designed to get your attention. So we're supposed to focus on them. And when we finish up the chapter, we'll actually end with a bunch, or actually just this lecture, this section of the chapter. We're going to be talking about some of the things that tend to pull our attention and a little bit about why. But one more thing I wanted to mention was how we might test our ability to pay attention to multiple things at a time. And one technique that's really commonly used is called shadowing. And this works best with auditory stimuli simply because of the nature of the fact that we have two ears and we can process things sort of one side versus the other. So they would give a participant a headset. The left speaker would be playing, say, a list of bird species, and the right would be a bunch of different weather conditions. And so the instructions would be, okay, pay attention to the left side. Repeat every word that you hear out loud. And so you would have to go through, and everything that you hear, you repeat. And because you focused your attention on this side and probably excluded what you're hearing on the other side to better focus, when they ask you what did you hear on the other side, you might not be able to answer at all, depending on sort of the degree of focus and how difficult those words were to listen to and separate out. All right, so next I have a video, and this is one of those things that I have really missed being able to do live. So there is no, well, I don't have audio for this because setting it up on here is really tough, but there is text on the screen that lets you know what's going on. Did most people get about the right answer? How many people saw the bear? Possibly no one. There's a couple of different videos like this. I like to try and cycle through them because a lot of if you've never seen these before, it's very easy to be fooled by them. And they use that to their advantage here. This is actually an advertisement trying to get people to think about the things they're not paying attention to. So specifically, as a driver, pay attention to cyclists, people in vehicles or on vehicles that are different than what you're paying attention to. Because it can be very, very easy to miss something that you're not looking for. And so this process is called inattention blindness or inattentional blindness, depending on the source. But this basically says that there can be stimuli that you don't focus on. They can still register in your central nervous system, so it's not like your eyes didn't see the movement of that particular part of the screen. It's not like you were actually blind to it. But you weren't paying attention to it, you weren't focused on it, so that information never actually entered into your consciousness. So you saw it in the sense that it was passed through that sensory system, it registered in your visual receptors, but you didn't have any conscious awareness of it. So you didn't know that you saw it. And when you don't register that you've seen something, it's also very difficult to remember having ever seen it because it never entered into your conscious awareness, so it can't get stored with your other memories. So this inattentional blindness kind of focuses in on stuff that we might fail to see or fail to be aware of, but it doesn't actually imply that there was something wrong with the sense that we were using. So maybe you didn't hear something because you're focusing on something else. You didn't see something because you were looking at something else. And there's tons and tons of really cool studies that have looked at stuff like this. anywhere from getting radiologists to look at x-rays that had different images superimposed over them, to pilots in training failing to recognize that the landing pad that they were trying to get to was already occupied because they were so focused on their instruments. And being aware of these shortcomings of awareness help factor in how we learn about things. So the pilot issue was a big problem with training, and so now it's part of sort of a training checklist to, hey, maybe double check that there's no one on the runway or on the helipad that you're intending to use. Don't just figure out where it is, do a physical check that it's empty. So they can identify some of these shortcomings of human perception. And then, as promised, we can talk about things that actually influence our attention. What determines whether we pay attention to something or not? The nature of the stimulus is one of the biggest factors here. So we are predisposed to pay attention to particular things. And this kind of goes along with stuff we talked about in our sensation and perception lecture, which is why this tied in really nicely as the next topic. But we tend to notice things that are different, and we tend to filter out or ignore things that stay constant. So if something new or novel shows up, we're going to pay attention to it because it's different. If a new billboard goes up in your neighborhood, you're going to notice it the first day, and you might even register what it's advertising. But once it's been there for a couple of weeks, once you've walked past it every day, you're not going to pay any more attention to it. Stuff that moves is really good at grabbing our attention, especially stuff that's moving toward us. We tend to dismiss things like cars that are driving away from us, but a car that's heading toward us is something that could be a threat, so we're going to pay a lot more attention to it. And a fantastic example of our ability to perceive things that move. I don't know if you've seen this, it might be a little bit before your time, but when one of the journalists threw a shoe at President Bush, he was standing at a podium, he had someone standing next to him, and President Bush ducked immediately, very, very quickly, to avoid getting hit in the face with a shoe. The guy standing next to him ended up ducking almost comically late, long after the shoe had passed, long before it would have made any difference at all. And the reason for that is that we have an extra sort of backup reflexive system that evaluates if we're in the path of danger. So when it was coming towards him, his brain said, if you don't move, you'll get hit, and he reflexively ducked. Whereas the other guy's brain was able to say, it's not going to hit us, so when his consciousness processed it eventually, he then stepped out of the way, but it was slower, it wasn't a reflexive reaction, so it took longer. But it's such a perfect example of watching two people react at very different speeds to the exact same stimulus. And it highlights just how specialized our brains are to pick out information like trajectory. We also tend to pay attention to things that are high in intensity, whether they're bright or loud or colored. All of those things can draw our attention, and especially if they contrast their surroundings. And so there can be biologically relevant things. We can have things that are of personal significance. And so we can break down some of those specifics by looking at things like internal state. So if you are very hungry, you might be a lot more susceptible to advertisements for food. Maybe you walk through a food court and you smell the bread smell that comes out of a Subway sandwich shop. If you are hungry, that's going to be very, very noticeable. But if you've just finished eating, then maybe the smell is less noticeable because it's irrelevant to you. You don't need food, so you're going to ignore it. And when we're tired, we tend to be very insensitive to external cues. It's almost like we're focused internally on how tired we are, but we also have very reduced mental resources, so it's kind of a double whammy of ignoring things in the environment. For personal motivation and interest, things that you have experience with, things that you have interacted with, and things that you care about tend to grab your attention. So somebody who studies plants would notice plants when they go out. Those of us who study birds tend to annoy others, pointing out the sounds and appearance of birds. And somebody else might never notice that. I've gone on hikes in the mountains, and I've pointed out the difference between a black-capped chickadee and a mountain chickadee, which most people would never figure out. But training and a lot of exposure to both means that I'm capable of attending to those differences. So each individual's motivation, things that they find interesting and things that they care about, will draw their attention a whole lot more. And even previous experience, stuff that you're used to, you might have extra information that makes something stand out to you. So maybe you've played a video game for a really, really long time, and you've learned to watch for particular patterns. Great examples of this is playing the old Super Mario games or even the old Pokemon games. There are particular locations where once you've played long enough, you get a feeling that there's probably a hidden item or a vine that gets you to an extra level or a hidden area. And it's really hard to describe to someone exactly what makes you think that, but you have a sense that there's something there that's probably worth checking out. So that experience shapes how you interpret that information, but also draws your attention. And then for general attentional predispositions, these are things that we have sort of a biological drive to notice. So we can make some evolutionary connections here. It makes sense that we might very quickly notice an attractive face. And that's because an attractive face usually indicates a good mate, so it would be important to notice that. We are also really, really good at identifying angry or fearful faces, even in crowded settings. And this makes sense again. Someone who's afraid is probably afraid of something, and someone who is angry might be a threat. So it makes sense to be aware of those so that you can avoid anything potentially damaging. We already mentioned the fact that we're good at focusing on moving stimuli, especially if we're in sort of the line of fire. And we're even predisposed to things like particular colors. You might find that red is a little bit more eye-catching. And that's because of other stuff that we tend to associate with red, things like berries and food, but even things like, if we think of like yellow patterning on poisonous creatures, that's another indicator to pay attention to them to avoid them. So there's lots of these little predispositions, little things that our brains are kind of hardwired to look for and pay attention to for a whole bunch of different reasons. And then we can wrap up with this idea of our attention in the periphery. And again, this ties back into our chat about vision and perception with vision. So our peripheral view is pretty much exclusively done with rods. Say it the right way. And our rods are really good at seeing sort of black and white, the presence or absence of color, or the presence or absence of light, as well as things that are in movement. Our rods are also highly specialized to pick up biologically relevant stimuli. We can tell if something is bear-shaped or if it is chair-shaped just from our peripheral view. We're very, very good at picking those sorts of things out. And of course, that goes along with the fact that we get really detailed vision from our fovea using our cones at our focal point. And so that sensitivity to things that might be biologically relevant, it makes sense that we can draw our attention very quickly to something that might look like a bear, especially a moving bear. That should bring our focus and our focal point to look directly at it. So we have a very quick response, and we're very good at classifying things when they are sort of naturally silhouetted. We're a lot better for natural stimuli. The artificial ones, not so much. But we can tell natural versus artificial, and it gives us that indication that we should shift our attention, especially if something is deemed a threat. So that's a pretty neat place to wrap up for today. As I said before, we're going to hop between a bunch of really strange topics for this chapter. We're going to cover everything from hypnosis and sleep to adjusting consciousness and everything in between. So we'll hop around further on. We'll probably finish up not this week, but next week. Because I don't think I can fit all of that into a 50-minute lecture. But I will see you on Friday, and we'll see how far we get.